Tokyo, November 1943. The winter wind came cold off Tokyo Bay, rattling the thin glass windows of the Naval General Staff building. The war had entered its third year, and the air in the capital carried a quiet exhaustion. Food rations were thinner. Uniforms were patched. Yet inside the upper floors of the Ministry of the Navy, officers still moved with formality and precision, their footsteps echoing through polished corridors lined with maps of the Pacific. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, 28 years old, walked those corridors each morning at precisely 7:45. He was a graduate of Adajima Naval Academy, class of 1937, a technical officer by training, fluent in English and mathematics. Before the war, he had spent a brief period as a liaison in London, studying foreign naval systems. Those experiences earned him a position in the Naval Intelligence Bureau, 3rd Analysis Section, the division responsible for assessing Allied manpower and fleet strength. Tanaka was not a field officer. His battles were fought in numbers and reports. Each day, he sifted through radio intercepts, captured documents, and aerial photographs. His task was to give Japan's admirals a clear picture of the U.S. Navy's capabilities, or at least what they believed was cleared on the morning of November 12, 1943. Tanaka entered room 307, his workspace, balancing a stack of folders under one arm. A kerosene heater hissed weakly in the corner, struggling against the cold. The smell of tobacco hung in the air. Two junior clerks were already at their desks, hunched over stacks of carbon-copied reports. "Morning, Lieutenant," said Petty Officer Yoshida, his assistant, a 23-year-old conscripted clerk who had once worked at a shipping company in Yokohama. His hands were stained with ink, his uniform slightly oversized. Tanaka nodded, setting his folders down. "Any new intercepts from Hawaii?" "Nothing clear. Just weather traffic and cargo manifests. I've cross-checked the fleet registry. No major increases in U.S. ships since last month," Yoshida replied. Tanaka sat and opened the top folder. It contained a thin summary labeled, "United States Naval Personnel Estimate, December 1943. The report projected 296,000 enlisted sailors and 13,000 officers active across all U.S. fleets. It was a figure the General Staff had circulated for months. The foundation of Japan's planning assumptions. At 9 a.m., the door opened, and Captain Sakurai entered, his face composed but weary. In his early 40s, Sakurai was one of the Navy's career intelligence officers, a man who had seen the rapid modernization of Japan's fleet in the 1930s and believed deeply in the doctrine of decisive battle. He placed a folder on Tanaka's desk. "The Admiral wants an updated estimate by this evening," Sakurai said. "Our analysts believe the Americans can't expand much further. Their manpower must be reaching its peak. You'll confirm that?" "Yes, sir," Tanaka answered, keeping his tone neutral. Sakurai studied him for a moment. "Don't overcomplicate it. The Army's already questioning our figures. They think we exaggerate American strength. Give the Admiral a clean report, concise, confident." When Sakurai left, Tanaka exhaled slowly. He understood the unspoken rule. Intelligence that created doubt was unwelcome. The rest of the morning was a blur of numbers. Tanaka calculated crew ratios for destroyers, submarines, and carriers. The U.S. was producing Essex-class carriers at an astonishing rate, one per month, but the Japanese analysts believed their manpower couldn't keep pace. To crew those ships, America would need hundreds of thousands of trained sailors. That, the Tokyo staff believed, was impossible. Yoshida entered quietly with a stack of aerial reconnaissance photos from Pearl Harbor and San Diego. "These are from the last overflights by our agents in early October," he said. "A few new hulls visible at the docks." Tanaka took the photos and studied them under a magnifying lamp. Rows of ships stretched across the harbor, cruisers, carriers, transports. In one corner, he noticed an unusual structure, a new kind of floating dry dock. He wrote a note beside the image. "Possible mobile base unit. Indicates expansion of repair capability." 18 noon, he walked down to the canteen. The room was quiet except for the clatter of metal trays. The officers ate in silence, faces drawn, shoulders stiff. On the far wall hung a large chart of Japan's naval victories. Midway had been quietly removed. Returning upstairs, Tanaka resumed his calculations. He pulled data from intercepted American newspapers and congressional hearings. Propaganda, perhaps, but sometimes truthful in numbers. The U.S. had nearly 1,200,000 men in naval service if auxiliaries were included, he estimated privately. But his orders were to report active sailors only. That kept the official number within the expected range. WW2 5:30 p.m. Captain Sakurai returned. Report ready? Tanaka handed him the document, stamped and signed. Summary. Estimated total personnel, United States Navy, as of December 1943. Officers, 13,070 enlisted. 296,000 projected growth limit. 325,000 by late 1944. Conclusion. Sustainable threat. Manageable with decisive fleet action within 1 year. Sakurai scanned it briefly, nodded and said, "Good. The admiral will be satisfied." As the captain left, Yoshida lingered by the doorway. "Do you believe those numbers, sir?" Tanaka looked out the window toward the faint glow of Tokyo's industrial district. "They fit what headquarters wants to believe," he said quietly. "You mean they're wrong?" "I mean they're comfortable." He closed his ledger and straightened the map on the wall. On the far wall hung a large chart of Japan's naval victories. Midway had been quietly removed. Returning upstairs, Tanaka resumed his calculations. He pulled data from intercepted American newspapers and congressional hearings. Propaganda, perhaps, but sometimes truthful in numbers. The U.S. had nearly 1,200,000 men in naval service if auxiliaries were included, he estimated privately. But his orders were to report active sailors only. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, drifting down between the city's dark rooftops. The sirens of an air raid drill echoed faintly in the distance. Inside room 307, the lights burned late. Tanaka reviewed one final table. A production report from the U.S. Navy Bureau of Ships, intercepted through open channels before the war. It listed planned personnel expansion to 2 million by 1945. He hesitated, underlined the line in pencil, then quietly tore the page out and slipped it into his personal file. He switched off the lamp at 11:10 p.m., stood, and looked again at the wall map of the Pacific. Tiny red flags marked Japan's holdings. Tiny blue ones marked America's. They seemed balanced, almost equal. It looked like a fair fight. In truth, it wasn't. But no one in that room yet understood how far from reality their numbers had drifted, or how soon the weight of that mistake would fall upon them all. The Pacific warfront was expanding faster than anyone in Tokyo could process. Reports from Rabaul, Kwajalein, and Truk arrived daily, each one describing the same pattern. Relentless American air raids, larger convoys, newer ships. Yet inside the Naval General Staff's intelligence section, the official estimate of U.S. naval manpower hadn't changed since December. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka sat in his office on the 3rd floor, surrounded by maps, production graphs, and decoded intercepts. The windows were taped in a crisscross pattern against bomb blasts. Outside, the city was gray and silent under winter haze. Inside, the air was stale with tobacco and sweat. It was February 10th, 1944. At 0830 hours, a teleprinter clattered to life, spewing a ribbon of paper. Petty Officer Yoshida tore it free and handed it to Tanaka. "Intercept from Saipan, sir. American task force sighted east of Truk. Estimated 10 carriers." Tanaka scanned it. 10? That's impossible. Our last confirmed count was 6 operational Essex-class carriers in the Pacific. Commander Inoue from operations says the pilots swear it was 10. Tanaka pushed his chair back and walked to the large Pacific chart on the wall. 10 carrier groups operating simultaneously meant far more than the intelligence models predicted. Each carrier required over 2,000 men. 10 groups meant 20,000 sailors at sea. Just in flight operations, he turned to Yoshida. "Update the calculations. Assume a 1-to-1 replacement ratio for damaged ships." Yoshida scribbled quickly. "If that's accurate, the Americans must have over He paused, doing the math. Over 1 million men at sea, sir. Tanaka frowned. No, that can't be right. He looked again at the chart, then down at his data sheets. We would have seen recruitment or training surges in their public records before the war. Their navy was 380,000 in 1941. Doubling that in 3 years is unlikely. He didn't finish the sentence. Both men knew the word unlikely had lost meaning since midway.at noon. Tanaka attended the weekly intelligence coordination meeting. The room was filled with officers from the Army, Navy, and the Ministry of Information. The walls were lined with charts showing Japan's expected timetable for American offensive operations. A senior analyst, Commander Fujita, stood by the board. Our sources confirm that the United States maintains approximately 300,000 naval personnel, Fujita said, tapping a pointer against the chart. Industrial expansion continues, but manpower remains limited by volunteer numbers. Tanaka raised his hand. Commander, if I may, our recent intercept from Eniwetok and truck indicate carrier activity well beyond previous estimates. It may suggest larger crew totals than we've accounted for. Fujita barely glanced at him. Lieutenant, raw intercepts are unreliable. American deception tactics are sophisticated. We will not inflate enemy strength without confirmation. The meeting moved on. No one spoke again of the discrepancy. That night, Tanaka returned to his desk and began reworking the data privately. He retrieved a microfilm record from 1942, one containing copies of U.S. congressional budgets intercepted before full censorship had taken effect. Line by line, he followed the figures: shipbuilding, recruitment, training, logistics. The numbers didn't align with the official Japanese assumption, but he found an entry that made him stop. U.S. Navy personnel appropriations for fiscal year 1945 projected 2,350,000 active and reserve members. Tanaka sat motionless. He copied the figure onto a clean sheet, circled it, and locked the microfilm reel back in its case. Then he looked around the empty office. The sound of typewriters from other sections had faded. Only the heater ticked in the corner. For a long moment, he stared at the number. 2 million. If it was real, Japan was fighting an enemy it didn't understand. He looked down at his orders folder, the one bearing Captain Sakurai's initials. On the top page, the printed summary read, United States Navy strength stable. No significant increase anticipated through 1944. He closed the folder quietly and said nothing. Scene shift, Truk Atoll, Caroline Islands. 2 weeks later, on February 17th, 1944, the U.S. Navy launched Operation Hailstone, a massive carrier strike on Japan's forward base at Truk At Dawn. Japanese radar operators picked up multiple air contacts approaching from the northeast. Within minutes, hundreds of American aircraft descended on the lagoon. Fuel depots exploded. Anchored cruisers burned. The carrier Shokaku, caught refueling, took direct hits and sank within hours. From the command bunker, Rear Admiral Nakamura watched through binoculars as the harbor turned into a firestorm. His operations officer shouted over the roar of explosions, Admiral, the number of aircraft. There must be hundreds. Nakamura lowered the binoculars. That's impossible, he said flatly. They can't launch this many planes from a dozen ships. The communications officer turned pale. Sir, we count over 40 carriers, large and small. Nakamura stared at him. 40. Yes, sir. Some appear to be new types, smaller, faster. The admiral said nothing. He turned toward the sea, where columns of black smoke rose against the blue horizon. The realization hit him without ceremony. Japan had no idea how large the enemy fleet had become. Back in Tokyo, the official after-action report reached Tanaka's desk 5 days later. It described the destruction of 30 Japanese vessels and over 200 aircraft. The U.S. losses were minimal. The file was labeled confidential, for staff use only. Tanaka read it 3 times, then wrote a private note in the margin. If Truk's estimate is correct, we are undercounting U.S. carriers by at least a factor of 3. Our assumption of manpower is now invalid, but he hesitated, then crossed the note out before filing the document. When Captain Sarai entered later that afternoon, Tanaka stood at attention. The combined fleet requests confirmation that our strength ratios remain favorable, Sakurai said. They're planning another engagement in the Marianas. The admiral wants reassurance that the Americans are stretched thin. Tanaka swallowed hard. Sir, with respect, the evidence from trucks suggests otherwise. Their carrier force appears much larger, possibly supported by escort carriers we haven't accounted for. Sakurai's expression hardened. Lieutenant, this office does not speculate. We report verified numbers. The admiral's strategy depends on it. Yes, sir. Then delete any ambiguous remarks from your next submission. Write it clearly. Our projections stand. Understood. Tanaka nodded. Understood. Sakurai turned to leave, then paused. You're a capable officer, Tanaka. Don't let doubt interfere with duty. When the door closed, Tanaka sank back into his chair. He looked again at the American production chart hidden in his drawer. The truth was there in plain arithmetic. The U.S. Navy was multiplying by the thousands each month. He thought of the men at Truk, sailors who'd gone to sea believing they faced a comparable opponent. Now their ships rested on the lagoon floor. That night, Tanaka added a single line to his private journal before locking it away. Our maps still show balance, but the Pacific is no longer balanced. We are fighting shadows. One's growing faster than we can count. Tokyo, March, May 1944. By early spring, the war had shifted from doubt to quiet disbelief. The devastation at Truk was known only to a handful of officers inside Japan's upper echelons, but its effects rippled through the command network like a bruise under the skin. Official reports described the loss as limited damage. The truth was catastrophic. Japan's largest forward naval base in the Pacific had been effectively erased in 48 hours. Inside the Naval Intelligence Bureau in Tokyo, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka read through the after-action summaries again and again, searching for a rational explanation that didn't exist. The data contradicted every estimate his section had produced. He had spent weeks calculating fleet strength, projecting attrition rates, and reassuring command that American expansion had limits. Now, those limits were gone at 8 o'clock. He arrived in room 307 and found Petty Officer Yoshida already at his desk, sorting signal transcripts. A radio set in the corner hissed with static. Morning reports from Manila. Sir, Yoshida said. Convoys moving east again. Bigger than usual. Tanaka placed his briefcase on the desk and began unrolling a map of the Central Pacific. Bigger how? 30 transports. 20 escorts. They say it's part of something called Operation Forager. Tanaka stopped. That was the American code name for the expected assault on the Marianas. If they were preparing for that scale of invasion, the United States wasn't short on ships or men that he turned toward Yoshida. Has the Navy Department updated our strength estimate? Yoshida hesitated. No, sir. They've ordered us to maintain the current figure, 300,000 sailors. Tanaka stared at him. Even after Truk? Yes, sir. Captain Sakurai said no revisions without direct orders. Tanaka rubbed his forehead. He had known this would happen. Facts were becoming dangerous. Scene shift. Navy Ministry Conference Room. Tokyo, March 21st, 1944. A long table stretched across the center of the room, covered in maps, pins, and typed summaries. Senior officers from both the Army and Navy filled the seats. The air smelled faintly of ink and kerosene. Captain Masaru Sakurai presented the intelligence update with his usual calm precision. Gentlemen, our analysis indicates the United States maintains approximately 13,000 naval officers and 296,000 enlisted men. Current shipyard output will add to their fleet, but they cannot man all new vessels at full strength. Across the table, Colonel Oda from the Army staff leaned forward. Then you confirm that their manpower is limited? Yes, Sakurai replied confidently. Their shipyards produce, but their human resources are finite. Training cycles and logistics will slow their deployment. Tanaka sat near the back, silent. He wanted to speak, but knew better. 2 weeks earlier, a colleague who questioned the same figures had been reassigned to a coastal garrison in Hokkaido. Doubt was now treated as defeatism. After the meeting, Sakurai approached him in the corridor. You wanted to say something, didn't you? Tanaka met his gaze. Sir, I believe our numbers are outdated. Intercepts from Pearl Harbor suggest larger troop rotations than we accounted for, and the truck reports show sustained carrier operations. That scale requires more than 300,000 men. Sakurai's expression didn't change. You're overinterpreting fragments. The Navy does not guess. It confirms. With respect, sir, I think we're confirming the wrong thing. The captain's voice hardened. Then you should ask yourself which version of truth helps the Empire more. The one that wins the war, or the one that confuses it? Tanaka said nothing. The conversation was over. In April, Tanaka began keeping his own set of records. Private, coded notes written in pencil in a small ledger hidden behind a drawer panel. Each entry summarized the numbers he believed were closer to reality. Estimated U.S. naval personnel, spring 1944, 1,450,000 total, including reserves and auxiliary forces. Carrier construction exceeds expectation, possible 90 active hulls by end of year. Ratio of new pilots trained, approximately 30,000 per quarter. He cross-checked those figures with Japanese production reports. The comparison was crushing. Japan had fewer than 400,000 active naval personnel total. Its pilot training pipeline was shrinking, not expanding. Industrial output was halved by fuel shortages and Allied bombings. Each night, Tanaka erased part of what he'd written, leaving only fragments that wouldn't raise suspicion if discovered. Scene shift, Yokosuka Naval Base, April 30th, 1944. Tanaka made his first field visit in months. His assignment: inspect newly trained crews for a destroyer squadron preparing to sail south. The young men stood on deck in crisp uniforms, their faces thin but determined. Most were no older than 20. A petty officer guided Tanaka along the pier. This is the Navy's new class of recruits, Lieutenant. The best we have left. How many of them trained at sea? Barely half. Fuel rationing cut their exercises short. Tanaka looked out over the harbor. The ships seemed smaller now, older, patched, and underpowered. He tried to picture the American yards he'd seen in photographs before the war. Rows of cranes, endless holes in construction, thousands of workers in coveralls. The scale was impossible to match. He returned to Tokyo 3 days later, exhausted and quiet. That night, he updated his private journal. Our enemy measures time in production schedules. We measure it in prayers. We do not count in millions because we cannot imagine millions. WY The Marianas Campaign was imminent. Reports spoke of new American amphibious task forces forming at Pearl Harbor. Tanaka's office was ordered to prepare a confidence summary for the combined fleet before the expected battle. He wrote the first draft truthfully, noting that U.S. ship output exceeded Japan's by a factor of 10 and manpower by at least 5. When Sakurai reviewed it, his pencil stopped halfway down the page. This section, he said, tapping the paragraph, will not be included. Sir, it's factual. It's defeatist. Sakurai drew a line through the entire section, folded the paper, and handed it back. Rewrite it. Focus on our tactical superiority and the limits of American endurance. Tanaka nodded. Yes, sir. He stayed late that night, rewriting the report until it said what his superiors wanted it to say. The final version concluded, despite American numerical growth, their logistical limits and dispersed deployment create vulnerabilities exploitable through decisive action. When the last line was typed, he sat back and stared at the page. He knew it was meaningless, yet it would pass through the chain of command and shape the next operation. He closed his typewriter cover, turned off the desk lamp, and looked once more at the Pacific map on the wall. The pins had not changed since winter. Red for Japan, blue for America. But he no longer saw a balance of colors. He saw the weight behind them, an invisible mass of men, machines, and industry. Numbers that filled not just ships, but entire oceans. He whispered to himself, almost as a confession, we're fighting the wrong kind of war. Outside, Tokyo's lights dimmed for another blackout drill. Inside room 307, the truth lay sealed in a drawer, unspoken, unacknowledged, and growing heavier each day. Tokyo, June, August 1944. by summer 1944, the Pacific War had become an equation Japan could no longer solve. Battles were being lost faster than reports could be written. Saipan had fallen. The Marianas were under siege. American carrier groups moved across the ocean with a precision that no Japanese analyst had predicted. Yet in the intelligence offices of Tokyo, the official numbers remained frozen. 296,000 U.S. sailors, 13,000 officers, and a belief that the enemy's capacity was reaching its natural limit. Inside room 307, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka sat in front of a stack of telegraphs from the front. The paper was thin, the ink already fading from overuse of carbon copies. He rubbed his eyes and stared at the latest summary from Fleet Headquarters, a truck dated June 20th, 1944, that enemy fleet composition at Saipan. 15 fleet carriers, 7 light carriers, 18 escort carriers, over 1,000 aircraft engaged in strikes. Tanaka read the line 3 times. That meant roughly 80,000 to 90,000 men operating in the vicinity of a single island group. The scale defied every Japanese assumption. He rose from his chair and walked to the map on the far wall. Red pins, Japan's territories, had thinned since spring. Blue pins, American fleet movements, crowded the Western Pacific. For months, he had tried to understand how the United States could field such overwhelming strength. The answer was starting to form in his mind. They weren't just building ships, they were building an entire system. Behind him, Petty Officer Yoshida spoke quietly. "Sir, there's a message from Yokosuka. Captain Sakurai requests your presence at the ministry in 30 minutes. Tanaka sighed, straightened his uniform, and tucked the Saipan report into his briefcase. Scene shift, Naval Ministry, Kasumigaseki District, Tokyo. Captain Mr. Sakurai was standing beside a large wall map of the Central Pacific when Tanaka entered the conference room. Several senior officers were already seated, logistics chiefs, production planners, and a few Army observers. The room was hot, the air thick with tobacco smoke. Sakurai turned to the group. "Gentlemen, the loss of Saipan is regrettable, but temporary. Our analysts confirm that American fleet activity is stretched thin. Their production is outpacing their manpower. They can build ships, but they cannot crew them efficiently. Lieutenant Tanaka will confirm this." Tanaka hesitated. Every face turned toward him. He placed his briefcase on the table, withdrew a file, and spoke carefully. "Our intelligence from intercepted naval communications and photographic analysis suggests otherwise, sir. American shipyards are operating at full capacity. Civilian recruitment programs, the so-called V-12 Navy College Training Program, and the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, are supplying additional personnel. Their total naval manpower may already exceed 2 million. The room went silent. One of the logistics officers frowned. 2 million? That's absurd. Tanaka met his eyes. "Respectfully, sir, the evidence is consistent. They've expanded training facilities in Chicago, Great Lakes, and San Diego. We've intercepted construction reports for new barracks capable of housing tens of thousands. These are not theoretical numbers." Another officer interjected. "You're basing this on propaganda." Tanaka opened the folder and laid out a series of aerial photographs, captured by Japanese reconnaissance before air superiority was lost. These images were taken from 1943 to 1944. You can see 3 new dry docks at Mare Island, 2 more at Bremerton. That's not propaganda. That's capacity. Sakurai stepped in, tone controlled but cold. "Lieutenant Tanaka, your estimates contradict Naval Command's standing intelligence. You will revise your figures to reflect verified data." Tanaka kept his voice steady. "Sir, with respect, these are verified." Sakurai's eyes narrowed. "Enough. We deal in facts, not theories." The meeting ended abruptly. As officers filed out, Sakurai lingered near the doorway. "A word, Lieutenant." Tanaka followed him into the corridor. Sakurai spoke quietly. "You're overstepping your authority. Our duty is to maintain clarity for command, not confusion." "Clarity built on falsehood is confusion, sir," Tanaka replied. Sakurai looked at him for a long moment, then said evenly, "You've grown idealistic. Dangerous in wartime. He walked away without another word. Scene shift, Tokyo suburbs. July 1944, Tanaka visited his parents for the first time in months. Their modest home sat on the outskirts of the city, now half dimmed by blackouts and shortages. His father, a retired shipyard worker, asked the question Tanaka had learned to dread. Are we winning? Tanaka hesitated. We're still fighting. His father nodded, lighting a pipe with trembling hands. When I worked at Kure, I used to watch the new destroyers leave the harbor. We'd lose one, we'd build another. But the Americans, I heard they launch a ship every week now. Tanaka didn't answer. His father looked at him carefully. You're in the Navy's intelligence, aren't you? You'd know if that's true. Tanaka forced a faint smile. I deal with numbers, not miracles. Later that night, unable to sleep, he walked outside and looked toward the faint orange glow over Tokyo. Somewhere beyond that horizon, hundreds of American factories were running day and night. Welding hulls, training crews, shipping supplies. He imagined 1,000 smokestacks rising in unison that he finally understood what the U.S. Navy really was. Not a fleet, but an industry. Scene shift, Naval General Staff, August 1944, that a new report arrived from the South. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japan's decisive battle, had ended in ruin. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were lost. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan had lost 3 carriers. The U.S. had lost none in Tokyo. The briefing room was silent as Admiral Toyota read the casualty list. Tanaka stood in the back, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the floor. The Admiral finally spoke. Gentlemen, we will regroup and prepare for the next operation. When the meeting ended, Tanaka followed Sakurai into the hallway. Sir, he said quietly, there will be no next operation. We don't have the men, the planes, or the ships. Sakurai turned to him, face pale under the corridor light. You think I don't know that? His voice dropped to a whisper. But if we say it aloud, the entire command structure collapses. Tanaka looked at him. Then the truth dies with it. Sakurai walked away. That evening, Tanaka sat alone in his office, staring at the Pacific map. He removed the red and blue pins and replaced them with 2 slips of paper. One read manpower, the other production. Under manpower, he wrote, Japan, 400,000 naval personnel. United States, 2,100,000 confirmed or projected. Under production, he wrote, Japan, 8 carriers, 10 battleships operational. United States, 120 carriers, 1,000 escort vessels, active or under construction. But he looked at the paper until his eyes burned. Then he folded it, placed it inside his journal, and locked the drawer. He understood now that Japan's defeat had already been written, not in battles, but in factories. The empire had built warriors. America had built an army of workers. And no fleet, no matter how brave, could fight the weight of a nation that never ran out of men, steel, or time. Manila, Tokyo, and Leyte Gulf, September to October 1944. The rain in Manila that September fell heavy and constant, flattening the palm trees and turning the airfield roads into mud. Japanese convoys streamed north toward Luzon, their decks loaded with fuel drums, ammunition, and exhausted men. American submarines were everywhere now, invisible, patient, and lethal. Every week, another transport disappeared beneath the sea. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, temporarily attached to the Navy Forward Intelligence Detachment, stood on the pier watching a supply ship limp into port. Its hull was gashed, its decks black with soot. Crewmen stumbled ashore, gaunt and silent. A young officer approached Tanaka and saluted weakly. Lieutenant, half our escort group was lost, the man said. We never even saw them. The Americans attacked at night, radar-guided. Tanaka nodded. Where were you hit? South of Palawan, sir. They knew our route. Every time we changed course, they were waiting. Tanaka turned toward the sea. Somewhere out there, beyond the gray horizon, were hundreds of American ships, destroyers, submarines, carriers, each part of a machine that moved with relentless precision. He had seen the figures himself back in Tokyo. U.S. Navy strength as of September 1944. More than 2.5 million personnel, 90 carriers in active service, 60,000 vessels in total, from fleet carriers to landing craft. Numbers that Japan's high command still refused to accept. Scene shift, Tokyo, Naval Intelligence Bureau, September 20th, 1944. Room 307 felt smaller now. The walls were covered in updated charts, each one showing the shrinking perimeter of Japan's defenses. Petty Officer Yoshida was typing a summary when Tanaka entered, his uniform damp from the rain. "Welcome back, sir," Yoshida said quietly. "How was Manila?" "Hopeless," Tanaka replied, removing his cap. "They're sending ships without escorts. We're losing them faster than we can count." He dropped a stack of papers onto his desk. Convoy loss reports, intercepted Allied broadcasts, production charts. Yoshida hesitated. "Sir, Captain Sakurai stopped by earlier. He wants a revised fleet strength report by tonight." Tanaka looked up sharply. "Revised?" "Yes, sir." He said, to adjust the American numbers downward. "Make them realistic." His words. Tanaka stared at the floor for a long moment. "Realistic," he repeated quietly. Then, almost to himself, "What's realistic about fighting ghosts?" He sat, opened the Manila reports, and began writing. That evening, the meeting in the Naval Ministry's underground war room felt different. The air was thick and humid, the lights dimmed to save electricity. Around the table sat Captain Sakurai, several operations officers, and two representatives from the combined fleet. Sakurai began, "Gentlemen, we are preparing for what may be the decisive engagement. The Americans are advancing toward the Philippines. Intelligence estimates indicate enemy fleet strength at approximately 400 vessels." Tanaka looked up. He knew the real figure was over 700. He had seen the signals. One of the operations officers leaned forward. 400 ships, perhaps fewer, depending on how many are engaged at Leyte. "That gives us a fighting chance." Sakurai nodded. "Admiral Toyota believes so." He glanced at Tanaka. "Lieutenant, confirm that estimate for the record." Tanaka's throat tightened. The silence stretched. "Sir," he said carefully, "our most recent intercepts suggest the number is considerably higher. Carrier Task Force 38 alone counts over 15 fleet and light carriers. Add escort carriers, destroyers, transports." Sakurai cut him off. "Enough. We're not here to recite propaganda. With respect, sir, it's not propaganda. It's arithmetic." Sakurai's jaw clenched. "Your task is to serve the strategy, not to rewrite it." Tanaka said nothing. He understood now that truth had become a liability. Scene shift. Leyte Gulf, Philippines, October 23 to 26, 1944. The largest naval battle in human history began before dawn. ATC. The Imperial Japanese Navy committed nearly every capital ship remaining. Battleships Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, carriers Zukaku and Zuho, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. They were to smash the American invasion fleet off Leyte, divide their forces, and regain control of the Philippines. But the plan was built on numbers that were already obsolete. From the bridge of the cruiser Nachi, Rear Admiral Nakamura watched waves of American aircraft appear over the horizon. Not hundreds, but thousands. The sky was filled with them, stretching from cloud to cloud. "How many carriers do they have?" he muttered. The communications officer shouted over the noise of explosions. "At least 20, sir. Maybe more." Moments later, the Musashi took multiple bomb hits. Within hours, she was gone. WY nightfall. The sea was littered with burning ships. The Japanese fleet had been shattered. The Americans had unleashed a force so vast that even their own officers struggled to comprehend it. A wall of steel and manpower that moved like a single organism. Scene shift. Tokyo, October 29th, 1944. Tanaka returned to headquarters 2 days after the defeat at Leyte. The official dispatch described the battle as a successful withdrawal after inflicting heavy losses. He didn't bother to read further. Captain Sakurai stood by the window, watching the rain streak down glass. "The Admiral has ordered a new assessment," he said quietly. "Of what?" Tanaka asked. "Our remaining strength." Tanaka handed him a folder, his private compilation of figures, months in the making. Sakurai glanced at the first page and frowned at UDS. Navy, October 1944 personnel, 2,800,000 active and reserve. Warships and auxiliaries, 62,000 plus. Industrial reserve, expanding. Japan's ability to sustain naval warfare. Functionally exhausted, Sakurai closed the file without comment. I can't submit this, he said finally. Then don't, Tanaka replied. But it doesn't change anything. Sakurai's expression softened for the first time in months. You still believe in honesty, even now? I believe in consequences, Tanaka said. He turned and walked out. That night, Tokyo's air raid sirens began to wail. American B-29s, hundreds of them, swept across the sky. The sound was deep, steady, and endless. From his office window, Tanaka watched the city burn. He thought of the endless American ships, the endless crews, the endless resources. The numbers he had once written on paper were now alive. Flying, firing, consuming the empire piece by piece. He realized then that Japan hadn't lost at Leyte. It had lost years earlier, when its leaders chose to believe the war could be fought with courage instead of capacity. The empire's faith was still strong. Its numbers, however, were gone. The first cold winds of winter swept across Tokyo in November 1944, carrying the sound of distant bombers high above the clouds. The people had grown used to it, the faint hum, the whistle, the thud of explosions somewhere beyond the city's edge. But for the officers inside the Naval General Staff Building, the sounds were no longer background noise. They were data, proof that the war was shifting irreversibly toward Japan's doorstep. In room 307. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka arrived early each morning, long before dawn, lighting the small heater and unrolling his new map of the Pacific. Every week, the blue marks, American fleet positions, pushed closer to the Japanese mainland. Mariana Islands, Ulithi, now Iwo Jima. Across his desk lay the latest intercepted American logistics summaries, decoded from open communications captured months late, but still useful. The numbers were staggering. Total U.S. naval personnel, December 1944, 900,000. Auxiliary and shipyard support, 800,000. New ships commissioned monthly, 200. Tanaka ran a finger along the line that read auxiliary and shipyard support. That phrase, more than anything else, explained everything. The Americans had created a second navy, not of warships, but of maintenance, supply, and logistics. A fleet that repaired, fueled, and fed the one that fought. Yoshida entered quietly, his face thinner than before, uniform sleeves frayed. "Morning, sir," he said, setting a bundle of reports on the desk. Updates from his Southern Area Command. The garrisons are running out of aviation fuel again. Tanaka nodded absently. I know. Even if we had the planes, we couldn't fly them. He turned to the map. Where are the Americans now? Preparing to land at Iwo Jima, sir. Tanaka tapped the island with his pencil, a speck of rock barely visible on the chart. 8 square miles, he said softly. They're bringing an invasion force of 70,000 men for that. Yoshida gave a faint, humorless smile. That's what it says. The Americans don't do small anymore. Scene shift. Iwo Jima, February 19th, 1945. The invasion began under heavy cloud cover. The sea to the south churned with ships, carriers, destroyers, troop transports, hospital ships, landing craft stretching from horizon to horizon. It was a floating city. American historians would later call it the most concentrated display of naval power in history. To the Japanese defenders on the island, it was an unending procession of metal and men. From his cave bunker near Mount Suribachi, Colonel Tadashi Kurabayashi watched the bombardment through binoculars. He was a real man, not one of Tanaka's imagined figures. But for Tanaka, reading the reports weeks later in Tokyo, Kurabayashi's story would become the human face of what those numbers meant. 30,000 Marines landed on the first day. 50,000 more followed. American ships fired over 6,000 tons of shells in 72 hours. The U.S. Navy now operated as a self-contained world. Factories afloat, producing, feeding, repairing, and killing without pause. Scene shift. Tokyo, March 1945. When the first reports of Iwo Jima's fall reached Tokyo, the reaction inside the ministry was subdued. There were no speeches, no anger, only quiet resignation. Captain Sakurai sat across from Tanaka in the nearly empty conference room, a cigarette burning to ash between his fingers. "I read your private memorandum," Sakurai said after a long silence. "The one you never submitted." Tanaka didn't deny it. "You were right," Sakurai continued. "Everything we built this war on, every plan, every calculation was wrong. We fought what we could imagine, not what existed." Tanaka leaned back in his chair. "You knew that months ago." "Yes," Sakurai said, his voice low. "But knowing and admitting are different things." He stubbed out his cigarette. "Do you still have your independent estimates? The ones with the true manpower counts?" Tanaka nodded and reached into his briefcase. He handed over a single page. U.S. Navy, February 1945. Estimated total strength, 3,100,000 men and women. Operational ships, 61,000. Reserve and support craft, 25,000. Sakurai stared at the paper for a long moment. How does a nation even sustain such numbers? Industry, Tanaka said simply. In belief, not in the emperor, but in production. Sakurai looked at him. Then we never had a chance. Tanaka said nothing. Scene shift. Tokyo streets, March 10th, 1945. At the night sky turned orange. Hundreds of American B-29 bombers swept over the capital, dropping incendiaries in waves. The city ignited block by block. Tanaka and Yoshida fled the ministry building as firestorms consumed the wooden houses around them. The heat was unbearable. The air smelled of smoke and oil. They reached the moat near the Imperial Palace and crouched by the water's edge, watching Tokyo burn. Yoshida spoke first, his voice shaking. "Sir, do you think they'll stop?" Tanaka didn't answer at first. "They don't need to stop," he finally said. "They have enough men and machines to burn every city twice." He looked up at the sky. The bombers flew in precise formation, one after another, steady, mechanical, endless. The sound was not rage or vengeance. It was process, the sound of numbers becoming real. The next morning, after the fire subsided, Tanaka returned to what remained of room 307. The roof was gone, the walls scorched. His maps had burned away completely. Only the steel pins had survived, scattered across the floor. Red and blue melted into one color. He stood in the wreckage and realized something he had not understood before. Japan had never truly been at war with the United States Navy. It had been at war with the idea that a nation could turn mathematics, manpower, and manufacturing into an unstoppable weapon. That he picked up one of the pins and turned in his hand. The paint had blistered from a heat. For the first time, there was nothing left to calculate. That evening, Tanaka wrote one final entry in his journal. March 10th, 1945, Tokyo has burned. The Navy's headquarters is silent, but we thought war was fought with bravery. The Americans fought it with arithmetic. They counted men, ships, and hours, and they never ran out of any. Every plane we lost, they built 3. Every sailor we buried, they trained 5. It wasn't a battle of fleets. It was a battle of capacity. And we never understood that until the fire reached our own streets. He closed the notebook, folded it once, and placed it in the breast pocket of his uniform. Outside, the city smoldered under a gray sky, and the last sounds of distant engines echoed through the clouds. The hum of a fleet so vast that it no longer needed to be counted.